Thank you very much, Paolo, for this very, very rich presentation, full of deep insights on so many points. I think it was very, very useful and interesting, not only for economists, but also from the point of view of political science, international relation, international political economy. So I think we have more time that it was scheduled because we have two presentations before coffee break instead of two, and we can now open the discussion. Any question, comments? I think we can collect three or four. See.
Yeah, for three, any states, but naturally.
Alessandra, please.
Thank you very much. The presentation was interesting and fascinating. I would like only to have your comment on one of the main challenges that, from my point of view, China is facing, which is in 2022, China is reaching the demographic transition point. So that means that in general is fantastic for a country because that means that after that point, the growth of the population becomes stable. And this was the cauchemar, was what was driving all the Chinese policy, find food for the population which was growing. And however, they decided they adopted a policy of a single child, which never has been adopted before. And especially the selection versus male, it also creates a population which is not gender balanced. So you cannot say that with the stock of this population you may have the same stable population. So this will be a big change in the Chinese economy. In addition, as we know, when you have a policy like this, you have an aging of the labor force. So the young, Europe, Italy and Germany are the leader in European field and European thing. And we cope with this when France is coping with this with center fertility and so on, we cope with this with migration. While China is very reluctant in adopting even
Absolutely.
now we see this bill. But this will be a big challenge for, and so I would like a comment from you because this will change the policies that the president will take versus the other countries.
Thank you, Alessandra. Francesco, and then you, please.
I agree with most of your points. Only one point gives me some trouble in following your reasoning. It refers to the interrelationship between trade and politics. And you said that until recently, the two variables were moving in a quite independent way. But historically, my impression is, and up to now, this has not been the case. If you think about the political foundations of European trade integration, for instance, if you think about the transatlantic trade prevailing after the signing of the North Atlantic Pact on a positive way, if you think about trade integration between Western and Eastern Europe and the former Communist Republic after the fall of the Berlin Wall, if you think about the trade concessions given by the European Union to the former colonies of Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, and on a negative side, if you think about the trade embargoes imposed mostly by the US on the weaker countries of Cuba, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. I'm a little bit puzzled about this.
Thank you, Francesco. Your name?
So I think that one of the big challenges also is simply the evolution of trade agreements, both the multilateral or preferential or bilateral trade agreements. So now they are not about tariffs anymore. And when we discuss about trade wars, we always say, yeah, Trump is putting tariffs back again on some products, and that's true also with China, the US-China trade war. But this is mainly due to other issues that are much more important than tariffs per se, intellectual property rights. China, potential UE-China agreement, this is clearly an investment agreement, and even with Germany being like presiding the European Parliament, this will never pass. This will need the ratification of all European member states, and it's given the ruling of the European Court of Justice, it's very unlikely that all European member states will ratify an investment agreement with China. So there are many issues now. If we look at trade agreements, they are more than 3,000 pages long, while 20 years ago they were like 200 pages long, and they were mainly tariffs. So how to put back again all the issues that are much more important nowadays for countries and firms trading among themselves that are not simply tariffs. Tariffs reduced a lot, like thanks to that WTO now, tariffs are not the crucial aspects of trade.
Prendiamo ancora una? Okay, one more, then we... Elisabetta?
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your presentation. You talked about a zero-sum game, talking about politics by Trump. Don't you think that you agreed that China is the one which has more benefited than about the openness markets, and probably it's quite difficult to come back to this sort of privilege. So don't you think that politics made up by Trump could be in fact a sort of preliminary step in terms of strategic commitment, just to redesign the game and then to get a sort of agreement? This is the first thing. And then always think reasoning in terms of game theory, but coming to corporate game theory, where the actors can in fact have binding agreements between them. We have a sort of free-sum game: U.S., Europe, and China. And so there's probably coalitions. And so what would be in fact the role of Europe? Because it obviously is the smallest given the three. So couldn't it be a way to get a clearer trade instead of being a bit aggressive?
Adesso.
Yeah. So what Alessandra is saying, you know, I absolutely agree. When I show the rebalancing challenge, all, you know, this story, there is the demographic kind of trends. Because as, you know, in many respects, this story of the middle income trap is so challenging for China, it's challenging for any country, but it's particularly challenging for China because differently from, you know, any emerging or developing country that arrive at this, you know, very important juncture with a certain positive demographic structure, China is on the opposite side. You know, just for the one-child kind of approach, China is a demographic kind of trends that is worrisome under many respects. The China government knows very well and has been knowing very well the major idea behind this big shift from quantitative low-cost growth approach to technological content approach. There is the demographic threat, because the idea is the only way to counteract a negative demographic trend is either migration, immigration, or productivity. In other words, there is no, you know, other way of trying to escape from this. And so far, China is considered, you know, the possibility that this big shift, not only in terms of more technological content, but the entrance of China into the technological frontier, because the immense amount of money, the immense effort that currently China is doing in terms of investing in artificial intelligence, investing in digital economy, in big data and so on, is something more than, you know, a technological kind of upgrading. So the idea of, you know, the strategy so far is that if we will be able to enter into this new technological kind of trend, we will be able to counteract this kind of demographic trend. In the meantime, you know, certain kind of modification in terms of demographic policy has been introduced. This is very optimistic from many respects. It was the same story that Japan was, you know, 20 years ago, something like, you know, in some way thinking about. So far has not been very successful, you know, in many respects. But I agree with you. This is an incredible kind of challenge, showing that, you know, we should not overemphasize the kind of unavoidable rise of China becoming from what is today to, you know, 10 or 20 years. Because this is, you know, so far, no country in the world has been able to, you know, of course, the mitigation could come from certain kind of migration from, but this is another, you know, kind of major step, particularly if we look at the political extraction system in China. Because this, as we know, you know, we see in few small area where, you know, this kind of heterogeneous population, what the kind of problem is creating. Imagine if, you know, you become two. So I agree with you. This is another, you know, is something that is going to become probably, you know, one of the most challenging, difficult kind of obstacle to this, you know, big rise. And what one could expect, you know, is going to negatively impact the rate of economic growth of China, more than, you know, what we see today. What I see a kind of contrast is this idea of betting so much in terms of technological change and technological restructuring, and on the other hand, you know, this penalization of the private sector in China, because this is, you know, an open contradiction in terms of final outcome. Because there is no doubt, if you look the share of private sector since 2013, 14 today, has been drastically reduced. So how you reconcile this idea of this technological dynamism, this technological, you know, change? That means, I repeat, adaptation and diffusion of technology, because that is the key obstacle to, you know, to produce a technological restructuring. It's not so much to produce new technology. Of course, you know, it means investment, but the major problem is how to adapt and diffuse the technology. That is the difference between a dynamic system and, you know, a stagnating system. So from this point of view, I think there is an open contradiction, and, you know, I don't know what is going to happen, but certainly is a kind of a topic that one should monitor, you know, in very detailed terms. Trade and politics, and political power and power. Trade and power. This is, you know, a kind of issue that has been, I don't know, in the literature in the last 2, 3, 5, how many centuries? So I totally agree with you. I didn't want, I'm sorry if I, you know, transfer this. I didn't want to deny, you know, the fact that from this point of view, political factors has been always behind, trade relation, trade strategy, and so on. What I like to emphasize is we have been able, we have been, in the 30s, we have been destroying the international trading order by protectionism, diffusion of balance of power, with the dramatic effect of that we know. What's happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods was this idea that we should avoid another kind of system like we had in the 30s. So we should avoid in terms of the fact that we should give trading relation first a kind of reference in terms of rules and institution that could become reference point for the member countries. And secondly, we should avoid conflict between trade policy and macroeconomic policy, employment, that we had in the 30s. Because from this point of view, it's very clear that when we say, what is the relation between free trade and full employment? Is free trade producing full employment, determining full employment? Or is not the reverse? A full employment system is able to create a free trade kind of context. As you know, the Keynes idea was much more the second one. We need a macroeconomic context where we should be able to produce a certain amount of employment, full employment, because this is the only way to have the luxury of free trade. If we are not able to generate and favor full employment, we are going to very much likely to create different kind of system. So the Bretton Woods system was a system where trade relation had been a fundamental pillar to increase interdependence, and in fact trade had been increasing between US and Europe, within Europe, has been the driving force of increasing interdependence. But on the other hand, we have been able to create not what we thought, because as you remember, in Bretton Woods, the idea was to create at an international level a kind of organization like IMF and the World Bank, the ITO. But the International Trade Organization had been never ratified by the US Congress, so we had the GATT, that was a kind of pale agreement in terms of institutional, but it didn't work. Why? Because the system was a bipolar world, and US was able to agree with Europe. So we had many very successful GATT round, because US and Europe have been, under many respects, been able to find an agreement and transfer this agreement to the rest of the world, up to Doha, when this was, not anymore possible. So I would say that international relations have been able to be built upon rules and institutions. Economic relations have been able to, be separated from security and what we could say the power, relation. This kind of separation, I agree with you. The Treaty of Rome was strongly based on the separation between economic relation and the rest, and power relation, political relation. The idea of competition, as the only industrial policy in the EU was very much based on this possibility of autonomy of economic relation. And in fact, the defense, the security system in Bretton Woods was dominated by this US hegemony upon the rest. Many times, we've been able to find agreement because the defense system was the priority in many respects. Now, what I was saying, more and more, increasingly, this separation is fading away. In other words, we see this contamination between economic and power relation in many areas. So the economic policy, trade policy, monetary policy, financial policy are used not only for economic or efficiency reason, but for power and political reasons. And this is, something that is so frequently now that we consider this mixture of economic and security, geopolitics of the system, as the new dimension of international system. Now, European Union is ill-equipped with this kind of system. We are not at all, prepared and ready to deal with this kind of system because our economic policy is in some way, in the hands of completely separated kind of decision making system than, the rest. And in fact, at the EU level, we have a lot of trade policy instruments, but we have no defense or, other kind of security system. This is not going to work anymore. And in fact, if you look at the speech of the new president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she highlighted this fact. She wants a new committee in the Commission that is Economic and Security Committee. This is not by chance. But, I don't know what is going to, because she said so many things that, I don't know what's going to, but showing that this is a problem. How to deal with this contamination of these two dimensions? For example, if there is a decision made by a Chinese, Japanese, or Korean company to buy a European, a French, German company, and this is going to be an area that we consider, an area very important for security reason, for strategic reason. European Union has no instruments today to deal with this kind of decision. US has a kind of instrument, China has a kind of, Japan. We have no this kind of instrument because this is a national decision. And this could not work anymore because the economic space is unified in Europe. So it's showing that more and more, this new dimension at the international level is going to have an impact upon how in European domestic area, these two area are, and I do expect that, for example, even in the area of competition policy, there is now, an increasing request by different people, not at all, Marxist or statalist. They say competition policy is fine, but there are areas where competition and security are going to, merge. What we do? We simply say, this is an economic kind of sphere. We could not consider. This is not the same thing that is happening in the US, in Japan, and in the rest. So this is why I said, but I agree with you. This is a very common kind of thing. Very briefly now. See, yes, the idea of tariff is a very old instrument. I agree completely. Is a rough instrument. I agree completely. And in fact, is a kind of instrument that Trump has declared to use, not so much because he want, to achieve something specific in terms of, but because it's a kind of threat, is a kind of, arm in order to get something else. So the tariff is used in order to get I don't know, reducing the trade deficit or trying to stop technological upgrading or technological policy or immigration in, from Mexico or so. Trump is using a business approach, saying that this is the kind of things that I can use because it's quite effective. But, one should recognize that it's not anymore very much interesting for the business people, for example. And in fact, more and more, the kind of agreement that is achieved is more in terms of plurilateral agreement, group or country agreement, just because what you are interested in is access to the domestic market, is protecting your FDI in terms of protecting your intellectual property. And this is a much more behind the border kind of things. That tariff is not at all. And in fact, any deep integration has been producing this kind of agreement, trade agreement, where there is a lot of other things together with the traditional tariff border. So I agree with you. And the reason why the U.S. administration has been using so much because for other reason. And here I respond. I think that the Trump approach is again a business approach, saying when I have a transactional approach, I have to not give you any certainty. You are in a game, in a game theory. You are on the other side, so I want to get the final outcome. So first of all, I have to, in some way, give you uncertainty about what I want, This is fine for buying a building, for selling a building. It's not so much fine to, in international relation, if you look the kind of outcome. Because the reaction to this uncertainty so far has been, first of all, the firms in US, in Europe, are not investing anymore. If I have no certainty about what is going to happen in China, in other countries, the first thing I do, I postpone and I delay my investment. The investment at the global level were rising at 8-9% in 2016, 2017. In the last year and a half, global investment had been collapsing, is now around zero. And the result is international trade in intermediate and investment goods have been collapsing. International trade today is in negative terms. Global growth has been slowing down dramatically. Many people thought that this kind of US-China confrontation was not so much important for global growth because they were thinking about export and import distortion. So the classical supply shock. If I impose a tariff, this is going to change relative price, is going to change, the distortion of trade. This is a supply shock, and only at the end, consumption and investment. But that is not a major impact. The major impact today and in the last year and a half has been uncertainty determining investment, slowing down, and investment slowing down, determining, the rest of chain economic reaction. And in fact, for many months, even financial markets have been underestimating the US-China kind of trade relation. They've been very much optimistic about, of course, fluctuating around a deal, no deal, a deal, but at the end, not so much worry. Now, very recently, they start to realize that the impact is much more diffuse and much more intense for this linkage. The same story is with Brexit. Brexit has been, so much negative for, UK and Europe because of uncertainty, the generation of uncertainty and the investment kind of dramatic decline in UK and in other parts of Europe. So I will say, this kind of approach could work if you want to sell the Trump Tower, or if you want to buy a resort in Florida. But I have a lot of doubts that it's so effective in terms of international economic relations.
Thank you very much. I think it could be worthwhile if we keep short we can collect a few other short comments. Before Alessandra goes away, I want to just I want just to add on the point of demographic transition. I completely agree. The strange thing is if you go to a micro level, that is if you visit a company in China, notwithstanding the aging of population, it's very, usually you don't meet top managers older than 40 or 45 because the aging went along with extraordinary growth rate. And so it's interesting. Of course. Yeah, absolutely. That's the situation now. If you want to, you could collect two other, I think, Giuseppe. Please. Okay, other, please.
What about changing income inequalities inside China and the probability of the spreading out of a social conflict? I think that present riots in Hong Kong are only fact a transitory question, but perhaps I am wrong.
Grazie, please. Your name is? Carlos. Okay, the first one of the group, IMF.
I just want to thank you, thank Professor Gregory for a fantastic presentation. I was going to ask you, you mentioned, and I'm not asking as a member of the IMF right now, but as a former professor, obviously, just for your view in terms of when you mentioned the IMF and the World Bank, your view in terms of either to incorporate other nations. You mentioned, well, it cannot be that the Europeans and the Americans basically dominate these institutions any longer, and we keep repeating the same mistakes. You were talking also as a European, no? So what do you think would be better or more feasible to do? Reform the voting system within those organizations, or basically redoing the whole structure from the beginning? I mean, what was in your mind when you were advocating about it?
I just had a very short point. Your interpretation of the failure of Doha around the multilateral system is very interesting and focused on international relation, power relation. To which extent also an internal contradiction of the free trade approach played a role, that is the non-tariff barriers issue. So going behind the traditional tariff or no tariff issue, and including agricultural, including all kinds of state intervention, etc., etc. and including the Airbus Boeing story, etc. Was it a sort of internal, implosive contradiction of the concept itself and the other point, I completely agree also with all the instrumentary for new core issues, FDI, intellectual property, and technology. And I think with the next presentation, we'll move also to discussion of value chains. The last point is, so trade and investment is now the topic. The last point, when you said more reciprocity asked by EU, especially EU, and do you have the impression that China started to give a positive answer to this request of reciprocity? For example, in the field of a joint venture in automotive industry, China moved towards liberalizations. It's no more compulsory to have 50% owned by Chinese partner. And they did that in the one of the hottest moment of trade dispute, trade war. So they shifted to that field. I think it was quite an interesting point.
I will try to be much more brief than before. For the first, traditional competitive advantage and global value chain, I agree with you completely. It's much more complex to define the kind of cost and benefit of international trade relation in a global value chain, environment than in a Ricardo kind of a word, because as we know, Ricardian approach is very much in terms of final goods. Portugal producing wine, UK producing clothing, they exchange, and at the end they show. We know that even in the Ricardian world, when you go beyond chapter 1 of the textbook, many things should be added to the story of mutual win-win, because dynamic, and so on. But when you enter into the fact that it's not anymore final good that are characterizing international trade flows today, but predominantly is intermediate and investment good, the components of a final good. In other words, is not so much computer as a final good that is, characterize international trade, but the many components of of a computer that go back and forth in a different country. And it's not only computer, it's almost, an incredible amount of goods that today are the sum of many components, and these components are produced in different countries because what? This is, very important to underline this story, because here we should distinguish between one interpretation saying, but look, at the end of the story, the global value chain is going to even increase the validation of a competitive advantage, because instead of producing a final good, you are producing different components, but different components could be high-tech, high capital intensive, high labor intensive. At the end of the story, you're going to locate according to the factor endowment of country. So global value chains could be a sort of arbitrator that is going to, implement the Excher-Olin-Samuelson kind of logic, even more than, was implemented in the past. This is an interpretation, as you know, in the literature. Another interpretation is that this is not so much so,
because a global company has a systemic kind of logic that is something that is autonomous from, the different country kind of factor endowments. So you have a systemic logic that is within the organization of global company that could be compatible or not with the kind of structure of the final good. So this is showing the complexity of the story when we're trying to disentangle, Because, for example, when we read so many times the confrontation between a international, multinational company and a local government, or, both are right, because the global company is right in defending his own kind of system, logical system. This location doesn't correspond anymore to the possibility of having my, logical kind of system, so I am going to change, relocate. The local government is perfectly right in defending his own territory, his own goal. So in this case, is indeed the story of comparative advantage is indeed very complicated by this kind of. So I agree with you that, in economic terms, we should be much more cautious when we, define the story of winner loser. We know that at the end there are plus and minus, but if this plus and minus, and this is why it's so complicated. Even if you are so positive in saying, I want to compensate the loser, at the end of the story is indeed very difficult to translate into, concrete political decision. And in fact, now there is no seminar, no conference where people saying we should compensate the loser. But you look at in political terms, what kind of new policy we have? Almost nothing. I mean, we have the traditional policy that we know that in Denmark, openness is much more compatible with a welfare system kind of, because, the loser are indeed protected under, some kind, than in the US. And in fact, openness is much more compatible with, in Denmark than in many United States. That is not so much because Denmark is implementing specific policies, but because the social welfare system is in some way a way of mitigate the cost of minus, So I agree with you. This is a kind of area where, is indeed very important to enter, and trying to enter, but in much more, I would say, cautious way than we did in the past. About inequality in China, I think this is a problem in China, is a problem, a problem that, as it did happen in other countries in the past, economic growth, particularly when it's so, intense economic growth domestically, is producing a lot of divergences. There are dynamic area, dynamic region, and they are, stagnating. And the distance between the first and with the lagging behind is increasing immensely when you have economic growth so intense as it is. So, how to, in some way, trying to rebalance, trying to address this, that is not so much inequality, that is inequality in dynamic terms, is divergency then more than inequality. Because, it's something that is somebody that is, some area that is growing very fast, and the other that is remaining, from many point of view, stagnating. This is a major problem. One of the reasons originally of the Belt and Road Initiative was exactly trying to reorientating the growth impact upon this, loser kind of area. The idea is, if we are moving along this kind of of Asia, Europe. If you look, this is going to positively, impact upon certain region that in China has been lagging behind over the past, 20, 30 years. So this is a first idea how to make more homogeneous or less divergent, On the other hand, we should consider that in the case of China today, there is the rise of the kind of middle income groups. In other words, in US and Europe, we are discussing and dramatically make comment about the losers, people that been able to achieve a middle income kind of status and is now, losing ground. So the social mobility that has been so much effective in allowing people, being able to catch up is now producing this kind of fact that, more and more people is going into the, lower or poverty. What is happening in China, under many respects, is exactly the opposite trend, because this middle income kind of area is increasing enormously. So, this is, I think, something that is going to be considered so much important for one reason. I think that inequality is a dramatic problem, divergence is a dramatic problem, but what is a dramatic problem, in Europe and in the US is what we call the social mobility, mechanism. In other words, if you are in a poor condition and you have no hope that this poor condition is going to improve for you or your son or your, this is going to be the worst condition where you are. Because not only you are in a, poverty, but you are no hope whatsoever that you can improve your condition, at least in terms of what's happened in this country in the 50s, in the 60s, was exactly the opposite. The inequality was very high, but the people had the idea that there was the possibility of moving up, at least in terms of your son or your daughter studying. And this is not anymore so in our country. So I think not only inequality, but the lack of any social mobility has been in China, in Asia. It doesn't happen. So we have divergence, but the people is still thinking they can move, they can change. And this is an incredible mitigating factor, in terms of the political impact. This is that I think is a huge difference from very point of view. In terms of, very well, in terms of theoretical terms, is much easier to change an existence organization than to create a new one. Because, the international organization, any institution, once they've been able to exist, as kind of positive externalities that is very difficult to be recreated in a new one. So in principle, one should say that this could be or should be much easier to reform the World Bank, the IMF, and moving this international organization toward this new actor in terms of legitimacy and representation, then what is happening is contradicting this theoretical hypothesis, because we found so much difficulties in, for example, reforming the vote system in terms of IMF. We had some reform, but as you know very well, was an incredible difficult task. European country had not, been changing very much because the risk is that they prefer to remain in this large table, although this restaurant is not going to be anymore so frequent.
So the risk is this way. I don't want to move. I want to occupy, all this table. But, because what's happened, particularly in the first decade, but particularly in the recent 10 years, the country like China, particularly Asian country, has been creating new organizations, as you know, very much, every time saying, this is regional, this is a complementary. But if you look the resources, if you look the goal, if you look the strategy, they are, real competitor to the World Bank. Not so much the IMF. IMF is still, the dominant organization, but even in finance, there are this kind of agreement that is increasing. So my concern is that unless we find a kind of discontinuity, a kind of much bigger step toward this kind of reform, if we are going to extend the past approach, I am afraid that these new organizations are going to become much more important, and in the end, they are going to, in a parallel terms. So I think it's not over. I mean, it's not lost the battle, but we have less and less time, for responding to this kind. It's astonishing how now years after years, where every new commission declare we want a unitary representation at IMF, and at the end of the 5 years, the declaration remained there. The new one is repeating. This is, not reassuring from this point of view. So I will say this is an interesting paradox. In principle, we should say could be much easier. In concrete terms, we are, monitoring this kind of, evolution that is going in the opposite direction. Finally, what said, I agree with you, Giovanni. What I say, the Doha round has been, the failure of the round could be attributed to, multi-factors. And among these factors, certainly, is the complexity of the content of negotiation. Because more the business was going in global value chain, network, and so on, less trade agreement could be focused on, traditional tariff, on traditional border barrier. But the reason why I am emphasizing this composition of, these new actors is if you look, the main issue where we had this kind of conflict, particularly the veto power expressed by China, India, is not so much on the new area, but in a traditional tariff area, in the tariff, in traditional trade in goods. So showing that undoubtedly the more complex, sophisticated, articulated content of the negotiation have been increasing. Think about services. Services is a very complex word where it's very difficult to transfer the logic of, the good trade in goods kind of motivation, particularly because it's very difficult to do this kind of do-des, in terms of the services content. So services is showing that it's much better to go at sectoral level. I mean, trying to have different area where you could have at least a plurilateral kind of agreement. And I do expect another area where, together with services, we should have this new sophisticated trade agreement, is the digital trade. I mean, digital trade data is booming in terms of trade. I mean, if you compare trade in goods and trade, data and digital is 1 to 10. That is the intense flows. Are we, able to deal with this kind? I do expect that in this area, it's very likely that we will have a plurilateral agreement. I mean, group of few countries
that are going to fix certain rule, open the door and say, everybody that want to agree. But it's very difficult to think about the WTO, going into this new kind of complex area.
Okay, thank you very much. So I invite Carlos Mulas Granados to come for a second presentation. Thank you very much, Paolo. Trade wars and neo-mercantilism is also challenging the reality and the analysis of global and regional value chains or international production networks. And so the title of this presentation is Trade Tension, Global Value Chains and Spillovers, Insights for Europe. We had more time because of
Okay.
like 40 minutes presentation.
Okay. Should I sit down?
As you prefer. Okay,
Just, good here?
start, yes.